It wasn't one dinner. It was 8 months.
She wasn't the one I needed apology from.
Maybe if you put in half the effort you used to.
You are saying it like it was my fault I gave you 3 kids with this body.
Angela Ford stood in front of her bedroom mirror, holding a dress she hadn't worn in 3 years, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself really look. Not the quick glance women give themselves on their way out the door, but a long, unflinching look at a body that had carried 3 children, a marriage, and a version of love she was starting to suspect had quietly stopped being returned. Her husband Derek was downstairs, already dressed, already checking his watch, already halfway out the door to a work event she hadn't been invited to. He hadn't said the words out loud. He didn't have to. The silence in that house had become its own language, and Angela had learned to read every version of it. Tonight, she decided, she would ask him the question she had been avoiding for months. Tonight, everything would either break or begin. What nobody watching this story yet understands is that the woman in that mirror was about to become someone Derek Ford would spend the rest of his life trying to win back. And by the time he realized what he had thrown away, it would already be too late. Downstairs, Derek called up that he was leaving, his voice light and unbothered, as if the last 6 months of distance between them were nothing more than Angela's imagination. She stood at the top of the stairs and watched him check his reflection in the hallway mirror one last time, adjusting his collar with the kind of care he no longer gave to her, and something in her chest quietly hardened into a decision she wasn't ready to name yet. 3 big questions will follow Angela through everything that comes next. Why did the man who once could not stop looking at her suddenly stop seeing her at all? Who is the woman at his office that keeps appearing in the corner of every story he tells about his day? And what does it actually take for a woman erased by her own family to become someone impossible to ignore? Keep those 3 questions close, because every answer arrives exactly when you least expect it, and the final one will not land the way you think. There is a version of this story where Angela simply disappears further into the role she was handed. This is not that version. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how Angela Ford ended up standing alone in that bedroom, you have to go back 9 years, to a version of Derek who used to write her name on sticky notes and hide them in her coat pockets before work. They met at a mutual friend's engagement party in Ohio, both of them 26, both of them convinced they had all the time in the world to figure life out. Derek was the kind of man who noticed things, who remembered that Angela took her coffee with oat milk before she had even finished saying it once. Angela was magnetic in a way that had nothing to do with how she looked, and everything to do with how she made people feel like the only person in the room. Their courtship moved quickly, not out of impulsiveness but out of a rare kind of certainty neither of them had felt with anyone before. Derek drove 4 hours one weekend just to surprise Angela at her cousin's wedding after she mentioned offhand that she wished he could be there. Angela, in turn, learned every detail of Derek's complicated relationship with his father, sitting with him through late-night phone calls that left him rattled, never once making him feel like a burden. Their friends used to joke that watching them together felt like watching 2 people who had somehow skipped the messy part of falling in love and landed directly in the part where everything simply fit. Nobody around them could have imagined how differently things would look 9 years later. They got married 18 months after that engagement party, in a small ceremony neither of them could really afford, held at a lakeside venue Angela had found through a friend of a friend. Derek cried during his vows, something his own brothers teased him about for years afterward, and Angela kept the folded piece of paper he read from, tucked in a drawer long after the ink had started to fade. On the morning of the wedding itself, a sudden storm rolled in off the lake and threatened to cancel the outdoor ceremony entirely, and it was Derek who calmly reorganized the seating under a rented tent within an hour, refusing to let Angela see him panic even for a moment. Guests still talk about that wedding as one of the more joyful ones they've attended, less because of the storm being averted, and more because of how visibly happy both of them looked, standing under that tent, soaked at the edges, laughing about the rain, instead of mourning the plan they had lost. Angela's father, giving his toast that evening, told the room that he had never seen his daughter laugh so easily with anyone else, and that he trusted Derek completely to keep that laughter alive for the rest of her life, a line that would come back to Angela, unbidden, many times in the years that followed. The first 2 years of their marriage were, by every account from the people who knew them, the kind of love other couples quietly envied. Derek took Angela on ordinary Tuesday dates because he said Saturdays felt too obvious. He kept a running list on his phone of restaurants she mentioned wanting to try, and worked through it one at a time without ever telling her he was doing it. Angela kept her own small notebook of inside jokes, so she would never forget the specific way Derek laughed at his own bad puns, a sound their friend Bridget Cole used to imitate badly just to make Angela laugh on hard days. Bridget had known Angela since their first week of college, back when Angela was the one who organized everyone's schedules and remembered everyone's birthdays, and she used to tell people that watching Derek and Angela together felt like watching two people who had genuinely won something rare. Nobody around them could have predicted that the very thing that made their marriage strong, their total devotion to building a family together, would eventually become the exact thing that started quietly pulling them apart from the inside. Derek's proposal, 6 months before that wedding, had become something of a local legend among their friends. Retold so many times it started to feel less like a memory and more like a story passed down. He had driven Angela to the same lake where they would later get married, told her he needed to check on a friend's boat, and then walked her down to the water where he had strung up string lights between 2 trees with the help of his younger brother earlier that morning. Angela's mother, who had been skeptical of Derek at first, later told people that watching her daughter's face that night was the moment she finally understood why Angela had fallen so hard for him. Derek's own mother, Carol, cried harder at the engagement than she had at his college graduation, and told Angela privately that her son had never been this certain about anything in his life. Their first child, Sam, was born 2 years into the marriage, after a pregnancy that Angela later described as the easiest and most joyful stretch of her adult life. Derek rearranged his entire schedule around the birth, took 2 weeks off work without being asked, and spent those first nights pacing the nursery with Sam against his chest, humming songs that didn't quite have tunes. Angela remembers that season as the last time she felt completely certain of where she stood with Derek, before the slow arithmetic of parenthood began quietly redistributing their lives. He held their son every night. He told her she had never looked more beautiful, and for a while it seemed like fatherhood had only deepened what already existed between them, rather than threatening it. But children require sacrifice, and in most households, that sacrifice quietly settles onto the shoulders of the mother without anyone ever officially deciding it should. Angela stepped back from her marketing job to stay home with Sam, a decision that felt obvious and even joyful at the time. Derek stepped forward into longer hours at the office, chasing a promotion he said would set their whole family up for the future. Neither of them saw, in those early years, how unevenly the weight was being distributed, or how much of Angela was slowly being folded into a role that left less and less room for who she used to be, before any of this began. Before she left her marketing job, Angela had been on track for a promotion of her own, something her manager at the time, a woman named Patricia, reminded her of gently when Angela handed in her resignation letter. Patricia told her the door would always be open, that talent like hers didn't simply expire because she stepped away for a few years, and Angela remembers believing that completely at the time, filing it away as a comforting certainty rather than a promise anyone could actually guarantee. She kept a folder of her old campaign work in a box in the garage for years afterward, telling herself she would go back to it eventually. By the time their second and third children arrived, 2 years apart, Angela's entire identity had rearranged itself around motherhood in a way that felt selfless in the moment and would later feel almost like disappearance. Mornings became a blur of packed lunches and missing shoes. Afternoons disappeared into pediatrician appointments and school pickups. She stopped going to the gym because there was never time, stopped going out with Bridget because someone always needed her at home, stopped finishing sentences in adult conversation because a toddler was always somewhere nearby demanding her attention. Derek, meanwhile, was climbing steadily at work, eventually taking on a director role that came with longer hours, more frequent work dinners, and a growing team that included a new hire named Whitney Sloan. The first time Derek mentioned Whitney's name at dinner, he said it the way people say a name they've already said many times inside their own head. He mentioned how sharp she was, how she'd caught an error in a client proposal that would have cost the firm thousands, how impressed the partners were with her after only 3 months. Angela noticed the ease with which the name came out of his mouth, the small amount of pride in his voice that seemed disproportionate to a coworker he'd known such a short time. She did not yet have a reason serious enough to say something, so she filed the feeling away. What started as small comments became a pattern Angela could not unsee once she started looking for it. Derek began coming home later, always with a reasonable explanation, always something about a deadline or a client call that ran long into the evening. He started commenting on Angela's body in a way that was dressed up as concern but landed as something closer to disappointment, telling her she used to take better care of herself, asking if she had thought about getting back into a routine now that the kids were a little older and needed her a little less. He would say these things lightly, almost affectionately, in a tone designed to make her feel like objecting would be an overreaction to a harmless observation. Angela absorbed these comments the way many women do, quietly, privately, turning them over at night while Derek slept beside her, wondering if the problem really was her. She started skipping dessert at family dinners. She started changing clothes 3 or 4 times before school drop-off, catching her reflection in the hallway mirror and hearing Derek's voice instead of her own. She began apologizing reflexively for the noise of the kids, for the mess in the kitchen, for her own tiredness after a day that had started before 6 in the morning and hadn't stopped since. Bridget noticed this shift before Angela was willing to admit it existed, catching herself wincing every time Angela referred to her own body with a kind of casual, practiced cruelty. Bridget Cole was the only person who said out loud what Angela had been too afraid to admit to herself. Over coffee one afternoon, watching Angela apologize for her own appearance for the 3rd time in 20 minutes, Bridget finally interrupted her and asked when exactly Angela had started talking about herself like she was something Derek had settled for. She sat there with her coffee going cold, turning the question over, and realized she couldn't remember the last time she had described herself using a single word that hadn't first come out of Derek's mouth. Bridget reached across the table and told her plainly that the woman she used to know would never have allowed anyone to talk to her the way Derek had started talking to her. Around this same time, small details began accumulating that Angela couldn't quite explain away. Derek started taking calls in the garage instead of the living room. He began locking his phone with a code he hadn't used before, something he brushed off as a work security requirement when Angela asked. He came home from a supposed late meeting, smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't hers, and when she mentioned it, he laughed and said half the office wore the same drugstore brand, that she was reading into nothing. Angela wanted to believe him. She wanted it badly enough that she let the explanation sit unchallenged for another few weeks, even as a quiet unease continued building somewhere underneath her daily routine. A few weeks before the receipt, Angela attended Derek's company holiday party, one of the rare events he actually invited her to, and it was there that she finally met Whitney Sloan in person for the first time. Whitney was warm and polished, in a way that made Angela immediately understand why Derek respected her professionally, complimenting Angela's dress within seconds of meeting her, asking thoughtful questions about the kids, as if she had heard detailed stories about them before. Angela remembers standing near the bar afterward, watching Derek and Whitney fall into an easy rhythm of inside jokes about a client neither of them bothered explaining to the group, and feeling a discomfort she couldn't quite name at the time, something closer to instinct than evidence. Driving home that night, Angela asked Derek carefully how long he and Whitney had been working so closely together, and he answered without hesitation, listing project names and deadlines with the kind of fluency that comes from repetition. It should have reassured her. Instead, it was the ease of the answer that stayed with her, the sense that Derek had already rehearsed some version of this explanation in his head before she ever asked the question out loud. She said nothing else that night and told herself she was simply tired from the party and reading too much into an ordinary conversation between colleagues. The turning point came on an ordinary Thursday, the kind of day nobody remembers until it becomes the day everything changed. Angela was going through Derek's jacket to send it to the dry cleaner when a receipt fell out of the inside pocket, a dinner for two at a restaurant downtown that Derek had told her months earlier was overpriced and not worth the drive across town. The date on the receipt was 2 weeks earlier, a night Derek had told her he was working late with his team on a client deadline. Angela sat on the edge of their bed, holding that small piece of paper for a long time. Not crying, not yet. Just doing quiet math in her head about how many other nights had a story attached to them that wasn't entirely true. She thought back over the last several months, replaying conversations she had let go too easily, nights she had accepted an explanation because it was simpler than asking a second question. She thought about Whitney's name coming up so casually at dinner, about the locked phone, about the unfamiliar perfume Derek had explained away in half a sentence. None of it, taken alone, would have meant much. Taken together, laid out across her bedspread beside a 2-week-old receipt for a restaurant Derek claimed to hate, it told a story Angela no longer had the energy to talk herself out of believing. She put the receipt in her purse, said nothing that night, and waited for the right moment to ask the question she already knew the answer to. When Angela finally confronted Derek, 3 days later, in the quiet after the kids had gone to bed, she expected an argument. What she got instead was something colder, a kind of calm defensiveness that hurt more than shouting would have. Derek didn't deny having dinner with Whitney. He simply reframed it, told Angela it was a work thing, told her it was a celebration for closing a big account, told her she was overreacting to something completely explainable, and then, almost as an afterthought, he told her that maybe if she put in half the effort into herself that she used to, he wouldn't feel like he had to explain his every move to her every time he stepped outside their house. Angela sat across from him in their kitchen, 3 children asleep upstairs, and understood for the first time that the man she married had found a way to make his own choices her responsibility to fix. She asked him directly if anything had happened between him and Whitney. Derek looked almost offended by the question, told her absolutely not, told her she was letting her insecurity twist an innocent dinner into something ugly. Angela wanted desperately to believe him, and some quiet, tired part of her decided that night to accept the explanation, not because it fully made sense, but because the alternative felt too large to hold, while also managing 3 children, a household, and a version of herself she barely recognized anymore. For weeks after that conversation, Angela existed in a kind of numb autopilot, showing up for her kids, showing up for the house, showing up for everyone except herself. Derek was, for a while, noticeably warmer, bringing home flowers twice in 1 month, complimenting her cooking, suggesting they plan a weekend away once things settled at work. Angela let herself relax into it, told Bridget things were improving, told herself the receipt had been exactly the misunderstanding Derek claimed it was. It was, ironically, a routine doctor's visit, entirely unrelated to any of it, that ended up becoming the real beginning of Angela's transformation. arriving at the exact moment she had convinced herself there was nothing left to examine. Dr. Naomi Reyes sat Angela down after a round of blood work and told her, gently but seriously, that her body was showing early signs of stress her lifestyle simply could not sustain much longer. Elevated markers that suggested years of running on empty finally catching up to her. It had nothing to do with Derek. It had nothing to do with Whitney Sloan, or receipts, or late nights. It had everything to do with the fact that Angela had spent 9 years pouring herself into everyone but herself, and her body was finally sending the bill for all of it at once, in a language impossible to ignore. Dr. Reyes explained, in the plain, unhurried way she explained everything, that Angela's blood pressure had crept into a range she wanted to monitor closely, that her cortisol markers suggested a body that had been running in a low-grade state of alarm for years without any real recovery in between, and that left unaddressed, this pattern tended to compound rather than resolve on its own. She scheduled a follow-up appointment for 6 weeks out, told Angela plainly that she wasn't interested in scaring her, only in making sure she understood that this was a decision point rather than a passing concern. Angela walked out of that appointment and sat in her car for 20 minutes before she could drive home, staring at nothing in particular, feeling something shift in her that she couldn't fully explain, even to Bridget later that night over the phone. She wasn't deciding to change for Derek. She wasn't deciding to win back his attention or prove Whitney Sloan wrong. She was deciding, quietly and completely on her own terms, that she was done disappearing, done treating her own body and her own needs as the last item on a list that never actually reached her name. She started walking every morning before the kids woke up, just 15 minutes at first, just enough to remember what it felt like to move through the world as a person instead of a schedule. Those early walks were harder than she expected, not physically, but emotionally, the silence giving her too much room to think about everything she had been avoiding. She started going to therapy, something Derek dismissed as unnecessary when she first mentioned it, telling her their marriage was fine, that she didn't need to pay someone to tell her things Bridget could tell her for free. Angela went anyway, quietly, on Tuesday afternoons while the kids were at school, and began, slowly, to hear her own voice again, underneath years of Derek's. The path was not a straight line, and anyone who tells this kind of story as a smooth climb upward is leaving out the parts that actually mattered most. There was a week, about 2 months in, when Angela stopped walking entirely, when the weight of managing 3 children through a stomach virus left her collapsed on the couch by 8 most nights, too exhausted to remember why she had started any of this in the first place. She skipped 2 therapy sessions in a row and told herself the whole effort had been a phase. It was Bridget who noticed the silence, who showed up unannounced on a Saturday morning with coffee and refused to leave until Angela agreed to walk with her around the block. Just once. Just to remember what it felt like. That single walk around the block became the thing that got Angela back on track, not because it solved anything, but because it proved to her that starting over after a setback was possible, that one missed week did not erase the months that came before it. Around this same time, her oldest son Sam, only 8 years old, asked her one evening why she seemed happier lately, a question so direct and unguarded that Angela had to excuse herself to the bathroom to collect herself before answering. She told him simply that she was learning to take better care of herself, and Sam, in the plain logic of an 8-year-old, told her that made sense, because she seemed like she smiled more now. That small comment stayed with Angela longer than almost anything else that happened that year. The next several months became less about a physical transformation and more about Angela rebuilding a relationship with herself that had been quietly neglected for nearly a decade. She started setting boundaries with Derek that she had never set before, telling him plainly when his comments hurt, instead of absorbing them in silence the way she always had. The first time she did this, over a comment he made about her portion at dinner, he looked genuinely stunned. as if the version of Angela who quietly took every remark without pushing back had been so reliable he forgot she was capable of anything else. She didn't raise her voice. She simply said the words out loud and waited. She reconnected with Bridget in a real way during this stretch, going out on weekends again for the first time in years, laughing the way she used to, before motherhood and marriage had folded her into someone smaller and quieter than she actually was. Bridget introduced her to a small running group that met on Saturday mornings, mostly women in their 30s and 40s, rebuilding some version of themselves after years of putting everyone else first. Angela was slow at first, embarrassed by how quickly she got winded, but she kept showing up, week after week, and something about the consistency of it began to change the way she carried her body through every other part of her day. The physical changes came, slowly and without the urgency she once assumed transformation required. But they were never really the point, even though they were the part everyone around her noticed first. Coworkers Derek used to introduce her to at company events started commenting on how great she looked, and Angela noticed, with a kind of quiet amusement, how much more comfortable people suddenly seemed making eye contact with her. What changed most, though, was not visible in any before and after photo. It was the way Angela walked into rooms now, the way she no longer scanned Derek's face first to gauge whether her presence was acceptable. Around this same stretch, Angela volunteered to help organize her middle daughter's school fundraiser, something she would have quietly avoided a year earlier out of sheer exhaustion. She found herself, almost to her own surprise, drawing on old marketing instincts she assumed had gone dormant for good, designing flyers, pitching a raffle structure to the PTA that ended up tripling the previous year's fundraising total. Other parents began approaching her afterward, asking if she had ever considered doing this kind of work professionally, and Angela laughed off the question each time, though she noticed, driving home one evening, that the question had lodged itself somewhere she couldn't quite shake. 9 months into her mornings with the running group, Angela signed up for a local 5-kilometer race almost on impulse, telling herself she could always back out if it felt like too much. She did not back out. She crossed the finish line on a cold Saturday morning in April, with Bridget waiting at the end holding a sign she had made the night before, and Angela remembers standing there afterward, hands on her knees, catching her breath, feeling something she hadn't felt in years that she could only describe as pride that belonged entirely to her. Derek had not come to watch. He had a work call that morning he said he couldn't move. Derek noticed the shift long before he was willing to say anything about it out loud. He noticed the way Angela stopped apologizing for taking up space at the dinner table, the way she stopped waiting by the door for his approval before she left the house. He noticed, too, the way other men at his own company events had started noticing her, a development that unsettled him far more than he expected it to. What he did not anticipate was how threatened he would feel by a wife who no longer needed anything from him to feel complete. Adding to the tension of that season, a rumor began circulating through Derek's office that the firm was preparing a round of layoffs following a disappointing quarter, the kind of rumor that made every employee suddenly hyper-aware of how replaceable they might be. Derek came home distracted for weeks, short-tempered in a way Angela initially mistook for guilt over Whitney rather than genuine fear about his job security. It turned out to be both, tangled together in a way Derek himself seemed unable to separate. Around the same time, word reached Derek through a mutual coworker that Whitney Sloan had started seeing someone else entirely, someone from outside the company who had nothing to do with the late nights and secret rhythm Derek had built with her over the past year. The woman he had risked his marriage for had simply moved on to someone new, without any of the complicated fallout Derek had assumed would come with ending things. He found himself, for the first time in months, without either woman fully paying attention to him, and the silence of that felt far louder than he expected. Around this same time, in a moment nobody in this story saw coming, Whitney Sloan reached out to Angela directly through a short, careful message, saying she felt Angela deserved to know the full truth rather than whatever version of events Derek had chosen to share with her. Whitney admitted that things with Derek had gone further than a single dinner, that it had been going on and off, for nearly 8 months, and that she was reaching out now mostly out of her own guilt, now that she had moved on with someone else and had time to sit with what she had been part of. Angela read the message twice, closed her phone, and sat with it for a long time before deciding how she felt about receiving it at all. Part of her wanted to be angry at Whitney, the way she had once quietly blamed her for everything happening under her own roof. But sitting with the message longer, Angela realized that her anger belonged almost entirely to Derek, the one who had made vows to her specifically, the one who had chosen every version of the lie he told her over nearly a year. She did not respond to Whitney's message right away. When she finally did, weeks later, it was brief, thanking her for the honesty and telling her plainly that she hoped Whitney found something real with whoever came next. It was in that exact window, watching Angela grow more confident while losing whatever he thought he had, waiting quietly on the side, that Derek began trying to win back the version of his marriage he had nearly let go. He started coming home earlier, sometimes even before the kids' bedtime, something that hadn't happened consistently in over a year. He started complimenting Angela in ways he hadn't in a long time, telling her how incredible she looked, telling her he missed the version of them that used to take ordinary Tuesday dates just because Saturdays felt too obvious. He suggested, one evening out of nowhere, that they plan a weekend away together, just the two of them, the way they used to before the kids, before Whitney, before everything that had quietly built up between them over the last several years. Angela listened to every one of these attempts with a kind of calm she did not have access to a year earlier, watching Derek perform a version of effort she had once begged him for and no longer felt desperate enough to accept at face value. Slowly, she began to understand something important underneath Derek's sudden change of heart. Derek had never actually stopped loving the idea of Angela. What he had lost interest in was a version of her he assumed would always be available regardless of how he treated her. Now that she carried herself differently, now that she was no longer waiting quietly for his approval, he wanted her back, not because he had done the work to become someone different, but because she had become someone harder to take for granted. Angela sat with this realization for weeks, examining it from every angle before she let herself believe it. On their 9th wedding anniversary, Derek booked the same restaurant where they had gone on their very first date, requesting the same corner table, ordering the same bottle of wine Angela had loved back when neither of them could really afford it. He had written her a letter, something he hadn't done since his wedding vows, and read it out loud at the table with his voice catching halfway through, telling her he understood now what he had risked losing. Angela listened to the entire letter without interrupting, and when he finished, she thanked him honestly, told him it meant something to hear, and then told him just as honestly that a letter, however sincere, could not undo 8 months of a truth she had only just fully learned. There was a night, a few weeks after that anniversary dinner, when Derek tried harder than he ever had before, cooking dinner himself for the first time in years, telling Angela through tears that he knew he had made mistakes, that he wanted the chance to be the husband she deserved instead of the one who had let her quietly disappear. Angela sat across from him and felt, for the first time, something close to sympathy rather than anger. Understanding on some level that Derek's regret was probably real, even if it had arrived far too late. She thanked him for the dinner. She did not give him an answer that night. Carol, Derek's mother, found out about the full 8 months not long after Whitney's message reached Angela, and unlike what Derek might have hoped, she did not rush to soften the truth for her son's sake. At a family dinner meant to celebrate Sam's 9th birthday, Carol pulled Angela aside in the kitchen and told her, quietly, that she had raised Derek to be better than this, and that whatever Angela decided about their marriage, she wanted her to know she would understand completely if it meant walking away for good. The final months of this story did not end with the kind of dramatic confrontation many people expect from a story like this one. There was no scene, no raised voices, no public reckoning in front of friends or family. Instead, there was a quiet, private conversation between Angela and Derek, weeks later, where she told him, without anger and without cruelty, that she was no longer willing to shrink herself down to keep a marriage comfortable for someone who had only started paying real attention once she stopped needing it. Derek asked for another chance. Angela told him honestly that she did not know yet whether she wanted to give him one. For the first time in 9 years, that uncertainty belonged entirely to her. She told him she needed time, real time, without a deadline attached, to figure out whether the marriage they were both describing when they talked about the future was something either of them actually still believed in. Derek, to his credit, did not push. He simply nodded, and for once, let Angela's answer stand without trying to shape it into something more convenient for himself. The last scene of Angela's story mirrors the very first one, standing in front of that same bedroom mirror months later, holding a dress that finally fits the way it was always meant to, ready for Bridget's 40th birthday dinner rather than one of Derek's work events. Everything about the moment is different now. She is not waiting for Derek's approval before she walks out that door. She is simply getting ready, for herself, on her own terms, in a life she rebuilt one quiet decision at a time. Whatever she eventually decides about her marriage moving forward, whether Derek earns his way back into the life he nearly let slip away, or whether Angela chooses a future built entirely around herself and her children, one thing about her is no longer in question by anyone who knows her. She is no longer someone who waits to be seen by someone else before she believes she matters. She sees herself now, clearly, on ordinary Tuesdays and difficult Thursdays alike, and that single shift has changed the shape of every room she walks into since. There is another version where Angela builds a life entirely her own, one where Derek becomes a co-parent rather than a partner, one where the man in the string lights by the lake becomes little more than a chapter she closed with more grace than he probably deserved. Which version becomes true matters less, in the end, than the fact that Angela is the one writing it now, on her own terms. Was Derek ever truly sorry for what he did, or was he only afraid of losing something he had already stopped valuing long before Angela ever noticed the signs? Let us know what you think really changed him, whether you believe people like Derek ever fully deserve a second chance, and what you would have done in Angela's place, standing in front of that mirror on the very first night this story began. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.